Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to break down all of the combat elements present in the Final Fantasy XVI Dominance trailer. We'll also be referencing the Awakening trailer from a couple years ago at this point from time to time. Please note that this game is still in development and aspects of the gameplay or UI may change before launch, making this analysis a bit redundant if that happens. With that, let's get started. Now, the first actual gameplay clip that we see looks to be some sort of cutscene that's happening in the middle of a more important encounter. We see this several times throughout the trailer, but it can kind of blend with some of the more cinematic attacks as well. Either way, it's either a QTE or just a mid-battle cutscene, maybe even the intro to this battle based on the health bars, but we don't really know for sure. Now, in the first actual gameplay clip, there is a lot to break down. For one, Clive has performed a third perfect dodge in a row, and we can tell this from the action tracker on the right-hand side. We'll get into a little bit more depth about this as it pops up a lot throughout the gameplay in this trailer. We also see that when executing a precision dodge, as it's called, a shadow is left behind for a brief moment to indicate the frame the dodge was actually executed. This is really good for just getting to know your frame, something really important in action-driven games. Another UI element is a sort of radar. You can see enemies that are off screen are shown on the right hand side and how many of them there are. Just useful for tracking stuff that's not currently on the screen. We also at the very top left have perks. Now these are all sorts of symbols and we could probably guess what they are based on our experience with the Final Fantasy franchise, but more importantly we don't really know much about these. We don't even know if they're really active at the moment, as throughout the entire trailer the same 5 perks are actually shown up there. This could be part of the game's progression systems, this could be earned by interacting with certain things, maybe certain skills that you have give you buffs, or when you eat food you get that food looking buff. A lot of mysteries in there, but we can just assume that when these things are active they will be providing bonuses to Clive. Now, something interesting I noted that's only present in these first couple of clips, Clive's health bar actually shows his name next to it. Now, that's kind of strange, especially because it doesn't show up in the rest of the clips after this scene. So while it could be a possible indicator of AI allies or party members joining, even temporary ones for certain scenes in the game, I'm not expecting that. I think that's either something that was left over or it's because Clive doesn't actually have any of the other icons yet, so they decided to put some text there, which I don't think is necessary personally. Now in the bottom left, we can see consumables. Now throughout the entire video, we only see a potion, a high potion, and a strength tonic. It's worth assuming that other items can be placed on this bar, but what's also interesting is that the left D-pad is either not being used for an item at the moment, or it's used for something else entirely, maybe something that he has to unlock later in the game through the progression systems, but that's something we can't tell. The bottom right side of the screen shows a quick action bar. Now these appear to be the face button commands, with X being jump, square being attack, triangle being magic, and circle being a special icon skill. The R2 likely just provides access to more abilities, as we'll see later on. It makes me curious what the basic dodge button even is, or if jump properly acts as one mid-combat. After performing the precision dodge, he follows up with a precision counter with the attack button, possibly holding forward. It's very likely, based on the Awakening trailer and who's actually developing the combat for this game, that tilting the directional pad changes Clive's attacks into different versions, meaning tapping back, holding left or right, or tapping forward, or even holding forward. All sorts of different combinations and motions will lead to Clive executing a variety of attacks, more so than we see on the screen. After the precision counter, Clive presses fire several times back to back, and this performs burst shot into lunge into burst shot. The attack button isn't pressed, so that lunge is particularly important, but I can note that it does have a fiery sword around it, so I'd be willing to bet that burst shot is a back fire attack, meaning that you would lean away from the enemy on your analog, and lunge is a forward fire attack. It's especially likely for me given that burst shot's knockback properties are something you often see on a back attack, either that or some kind of launch, are just more common in these kind of games. Now it fast forwards just a few frames here to show Clive using his Phoenix skills and the R2 button disappearing in the bottom right. Again, it appears this is not the same as Phoenix Shift, which is what I initially thought it was. This is more likely just the player holding down R2 to bring up the current icon's special abilities, which the game calls Iconic Strikes. Each icon appears to be able to equip 2 attacks, and in this case he has Scarlet Cyclone and Rising Flames. In this clip, Clive uses Rising Flames, which knocks the enemy into the air and then goes on cooldown. There's an outer ring around abilities when they go on cooldown, so expect equipment and perks that can alter things like this, such as stats like cooldown reduction. One of Rising Flame's attack damage values also appears to be a different color. Now normally I'd chalk this up to indicating fire damage, but we can actually see a ton of smaller numbers hitting the enemy at the same time. This is likely something that is interacting with something that pops up on the action tracker called Will Break, and it seems to be hitting a weak point. I'll touch upon this a little bit later on. Jumping forward a few seconds into the trailer, we get a clip of a higher level Clive that has a few more UI elements. First, in the top left, we can see that Clive can have multiple iconic powers available to him at once and swap between them using the L2 button. There is also a limit break gauge, which fills as Clive attacks. We never see what the limit break is actually used for in this trailer, but it's likely used for certain icon abilities or perhaps to even summon them in the middle of the fight. In the bottom right, we see that while he has Garuda equipped, the magic slot changes to Arrow, indicating that the spell is attached to which icon is currently being used. That makes a lot of sense given the interaction we saw with Burst Shot Lunge and Burst Shot earlier. Now Clive starts this clip using Deadly Embrace to pull the Orcish Mesmerizer into the air before holding R2 and using Wicked Wheel for a juggle. Shortly after this, L2 is pressed and Titan is swapped in. Since just pressing L2 initiates the swap, we can assume that it cycles through them. I initially thought that maybe they would use the face buttons or the D-pad while holding L2 to allow you to freely swap between them, but again, it just looks like tapping L2 is all you need to do, and then it cycles through them. This is also indicated by Garuda being moved to the bottom of the list and Phoenix being moved up to the next spot. Once Titan is brought in, Clive uses Upheaval to pound the Orc into the ground and do an AoE attack, greatly increasing the limit gauge. It seems that the first target being hit triggers the simple iconic strike, which only flashes for a brief moment because of how many targets Clive hits. For every extra target hit, it triggers something called a collateral version, implying that they are just extra hits. Now, each extra hit is ranked by a number of stars, which don't seem to be consistent with the number of hits. Likely this is due to the proximity to the center of the upheaval hit on the ground. Clive also receives an ability finish, another contributor to the limit gauge increases. It's likely the stars themselves are indications of how much limit gauge a particular action or occurrence provides. Jumping ahead to the next clip, Clive now has Odin, Shiva, and Ramuh equipped, currently in the process of using Odin. Odin also has a bar that is gradually filling up, the first we see that in any of the icons. Seems that each of them have some sort of gimmick, and maybe this one is just extra visual. Perhaps a full bar means a Zantetsuken. Clive performs a precision dodge into a lunge which forces a takedown. Interesting to see the lunge because this one, as far as I can tell, and it might just be my color blindness, is not elementally aspected at all. So it's possible that the forward attack is a lunge regardless, but using it with the element versus the non-element changes some aspect of it. Now this lunge actually reduces the enemy's gauge down to 0 and forces a takedown, the equivalent of the full bar underneath the opponent being broken and the enemy being staggered. Clive then uses Gungnir to initiate a powerful attack. Each hit is doing 20% more damage, and it's likely this value can be increased through certain actions. The stagger gauge is also refilling, probably to indicate how long you have before the enemy is unstaggered. The numbers are also similar to the numbers we saw from Phoenix earlier during the Will Break after Rising Phoenix, but far more constant. Again, I'll touch on this a little bit later as I think I understand what's happening. The Odin bar also begins filling with two separate color gauges. The light bar fills before a darker bar fills behind it shortly after for the same value. This could be a case where you need to fill the gauge without the dark catching up to the light, rewarding constant combo strings. It could be a way of saving progress so the gauge doesn't fall down anymore, and maybe you would lose some gauge upon being hit. There's not really a whole lot to go on, so there's just a few possibilities that we'll have to think about. Now in the last major gameplay clip, which is also split into two halves a lot like the first one, Clive dodges the Coral's hit before countering with Diamond Dust. Now this is one of the weirdest parts because there's no clear indicator how Clive performs this, and I would have expected this attack to use limit gauge. However, since the gauge doesn't go down, it's either that they forgot to make it so the gauge could go down, so just sitting at 3 this entire time, or it's completely unrelated. I also checked to make sure it wasn't Cold Snap, and I'm pretty sure it isn't, because the previous iconic abilities like Deadly Embrace have shown to list that ability name on the action tracker, unlike the R2 abilities which read as iconic strikes, but this just reads as its own thing entirely. Diamond Dust freezes and also hits 2 targets. I only see 1, so it's possible the Whiskers may have taken a hit as well. It's either that or there's just something else tiny that I don't see on the screen. Now, Shiva's iconic strikes in this clip are Thunderstorm and Pile Drive, of which the former is used. It's very weird to see Shiva with a Thunderstorm ability, so I'm thinking these are actually Ramuh's abilities, but are currently equipped to Shiva's icon menu. It might allow for more mixing and matching of the iconic skills, allowing you to pull passives from the icon you're currently using, as well as that one skill in the case of Cold Snap, while actually using different icon skills altogether mixed with it. This is especially evident when you see Clive literally whirling around Ramuh's staff. Especially odd considering Ramuh isn't even equipped, so there's a lot to consider here, and I'm willing to bet the icons again have passives while you're currently in their forms mixed with their active abilities. We also see that the cooldown indicator for the skill actually shows on the normal attack bar as well. If you look at Blizzard, you can see it's showing there's a cooldown, but it's actually indicating the iconic strike that was used before it, so you can track those without actually holding R2. The next scene shows Clive taking a swipe from the coral and losing a bit of health before initiating an iconic strike. Since arrow goes on cooldown, and we know that cooldown shows on normal par now, it's probably Wicked Wheel if Clive's skill placements for Garuda are the same as they were in the earlier part of the video. This might mean that the same iconic strike is different depending on whether it's used on the ground or in the air, and it's also possible that it could be different with different directional taps as well. This attack also registers as a gambit counter, likely just due to Clive performing the attack as he was knocked down from the swipe. This does tons of damage to both the Coral and its takedown gauge, which it actually reduces to 50%. After this, Deadly Embrace is used to pull the Coral down. It seems on larger opponents, it doesn't yoink them into the air like the Orc earlier, but this one is used to force a temporary takedown. Given we see action indicators for Deadly Chain and Deadly Takedown, similar to the collateral upheavals we saw earlier, it's likely this interacted with both the previous attack as a follow-up, the Chain, and also that it may have interacted with the gauge hitting 50 to perform that mini takedown. The bar is at 50% before the skill is used, so I don't think this actually reduced the gauge by any means, unless it was by like 0.1% and we just can't see it. So this just might be a special property of Deadly Embrace on larger boss foes, which also seem to have health bars on the top right, as opposed to the usual trash where the health bar just shows over their head. The next attack is Phoenix Shift, which has Clive dash from his current spot down to the coral and does a couple of damage numbers. This reduces the takedown gauge and deals damage with those big numbers again, which I think we can finally talk about. As this is the final non-icon battle clip, I can only speculate that these bigger numbers are any sort of weak point hit values. The will break from earlier was likely some form of stance the enemy took, and Clive's attacks broke the stance and opened up a weak point hit. That's why only one number actually ends up being large in that case, with a bunch of small numbers around it. On other enemies, simply reducing the gauge forces takedowns for weak point damage, both in the staggered and non-staggered manner. We can see the coral is not staggered. It does not have a staggered gauge, but it's taking these weak point hits, as opposed to the normal enemy we saw earlier, which was fully staggered and was not only showing the big hits, but the damage multiplier that Clive was actually getting. There's nothing to indicate that a will break is the same as a stagger, given we don't see it anywhere else. Clive reduces the gauge in the rest of the video. As for the icon battles, it's difficult to pull too much from them. They pretty much just show off a big name attack from each icon, even showing us a question mark boss battle somewhere in there as a little teaser. It's kind of like a Marauder's mask with what appears to be some rocks or whirling branches around. Maybe it's chaos, who knows? How much actual control we have is difficult to judge, though if they are purely cutscene based, it'd be strange. I mean, limbs are even removed in some of these fights, so any place that happens, I have to assume that it's purely for cinematic pleasure and not something that is just expected in fights. Especially given these are icon-to-icon battles, they pretty much have to be major battles between Clive and the Dominants. We do also see that icons can be used in battles that aren't exclusively against each other, as Shiva is used against Liquid Flame, a boss from Final Fantasy V. Now, I'm still wondering if this is limit gauge involved at this point, though it doesn't even have one LB gauge, it's not full, and Shiva isn't equipped in this clip. Not to mention, Shiva doesn't have a health bar on the top left. It's possible it's an AI ally. There's some speculation that I'm willing to bet is true regarding who Shiva is, and it would make sense for her to pop up in this battle. But it's just kind of tough to tell with this part if it's just something that it's a PR clip, so some of the UI isn't exactly as it should be, or if you have more control than it seems. So either way, we'll just have to wait and see on the rest of the things. And that's going to be a wrap for my breakdown on all of the combat elements in this trailer. If I missed something, put it in the comment section of the video below. If you have some speculation, definitely throw it down there as well. And well, I'll be keeping you up to date on everything Final Fantasy XVI. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.